Well, for this week's Climate Close-Up, we're going to have a little bit of a deep dive into spring. We're going to look at how it has changed over the last couple of decades. We're also going to have a look at when we can expect our spring green up here in eastern Iowa. Now, in this map behind me, you'll see that spring has been a changing season, and like all of our seasons, it changes a little bit differently depending on where you are in the country. Parts of the Dakotas have seen a little bit of cooling, as a matter of fact, as we have gone through spring since 1970, but other parts of the country have seen a different story. We've seen warming temperatures in the western parts of the U.S., especially the desert Southwest. We've also seen some warming temperatures in the eastern half of the U.S. Now, those changes in temperatures have an impact on when plants leaf out and, in a way, when spring begins. As we have a look at how spring has changed, you can see that we're looking at marginal changes in the start of spring in those areas that have either seen cooling or not a ton of change in temperatures, changes of just a couple of days. But in those areas where we've seen warmer temperatures in the spring, we also see an earlier start to spring, especially in the mountainous areas of, again, the western U.S., as well as farther out east where we have those warmer temperatures. We're seeing spring starting close to a week or more earlier in those specific locations. Now, here in eastern Iowa, again, we've seen those marginal changes of just a day or two earlier or later as we have looked back over the last couple of decades. But in terms of when we can expect our spring green up, let's have a look at this map. Now, this map shows natural vegetation across all of Iowa. So, of course, with us being a predominantly agricultural state, there's a lot of white space because there's not a ton of natural vegetation. But the little bit of vegetation that we see, we're seeing some yellow coloration, some red coloration, a little bit of orange coloration in those trees that are in river valleys across the state. That tells us that we can expect our spring green up sometime in April. Generally, mid to late April is when we'll see those wild trees and shrubs start to green up and when those first leaves will pop out. Now, let's add crops into the equation here because, of course, once we plant corn and soybeans and the landscape begins to green up, that's when we really start to see a green and quickly growing landscape. Depending on when those crops are planted in the southern parts of the state, we're looking at early to mid-April for that green up of the landscape in terms of crops. Farther north, where corn's planted a little bit later, as well as soybeans, we're looking at a later start to that green up, as late as May and even into early June. So we'll have to keep an eye on and see how spring changes in the coming decades. But in the meantime, that is what we have to look forward to for this week's Climate Close-Up as spring continues to approach.